Great to be here with you too.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So
Okay. I actually do have the thing up,
do you?
the
Okay.
channel, so
So yeah, awesome. Well, it's been a while since we've talked. What's new in your world?
oh my goodness. Well, I think okay, it's my okay.
You got a delay there?
I have a delay.
Is it still doing it? That's super annoying.
Okay. So wait a minute. Yeah, the delay is like speaking back to me. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so what's new in my world? So we've launched, yes, yes. Hold on. I might actually have to, yes. Yes, let me get out of okay. I think I have okay, I got out of the live stream. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear
Oh,
me?
okay.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. So I might have to because the delay, I like hear myself talking back to
Oh,
myself
that's
like
so funny. That's super annoying.
30
Yeah.
seconds later.
Yeah.
Anyhow, yeah, so no, what's new in our world? So critical therapy antidote. So interestingly, I was on TMZ a couple of weeks ago and it was an interesting, very quick few seconds, a few minutes maybe, spot talking about the wokeism and whatnot. So I was able to plug CTA. I didn't feel like it was, I had said all, too much in general. It was really short and I kind of barely got it in. However, what I found out later is that there was some traffic to the site
Mm.
after that interview.
To the
So
CTA site?
to the CTA site.
And that's
So Val
critical
Thomas,
therapy antidote dot
antidote,
org. Antidote dot
correct.
org. Yeah.
Yep,
Okay.
yep. And
Mhm.
so that was interesting because Val had told me that a few people mentioned, that they had seen this clip and wanted to get in touch with, not necessarily me, but just what we're doing as an organization. So I thought,
Mhm.
okay, well, and interestingly, after that, I had a conversation with real time with Bill Maher.
Oh, cool.
Um, so one of his segment producers spoke to me and she had said that they had followed kind of all the podcasts we've done. So I'm
Mhm.
sure they've seen you too.
Mhm.
And they wanted to know a little bit more about what I had to say. And there's a really intense vetting process that kind of goes into that.
I
And I
bet.
didn't know
Yeah.
that.
Okay.
So I mean, we're talking about from the time that I was a child and my parents' immigration story up until now, and
Mhm.
all of the sort of changes and things that came along the way. So it was interesting. So
That's what
I,
they talked about with you? The
yeah,
Bill
so
Maher crew? Okay.
yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. It was kind of. I mean, it was a
And
vetting
they wanted your whole
process.
bio, basically.
They wanted my entire bio. They wanted
Yeah.
to they wanted to know how I came to see the world the way that I did,
Oh,
and
wow.
how I came to see the profession the way that I did, how
Hmm.
I came to see, all of these components. And so I love that they did all that vetting, but it's, then that gets then sent back to
Hmm.
Bill by his producer, and then I think they figure out what they want to do and not do and whatnot. So
Oh, that's
it may be a
interesting.
few weeks or so before there's any news on whether or
Mm.
not but I mean, the good part, I guess there's many good pieces here, but one component is the shift from this kind of radical left, and I don't think Bill Maher was that radical anyhow. He always had, I think, a more centrist view. That's just
Mhm,
how I
mhm.
had seen him. I don't know, but if that's been the case his whole career. But I did feel as though he was kind of a little bit, just based on some of the comments he made about certain,
Mhm.
anyhow. So,
I've seen some things he said recently, just some clips. I don't really follow the show like regularly or
mm,
anything, but I've seen some clips and I've been impressed with his take. Seems really pretty
yes,
grounded and reasonable.
yes, and I think that's yes, and I think that's very promising. So,
Mhm.
other than that, we've just tried to, we're doing this podcast for Critical Therapy Antidote to launch the book. Will be launched, I believe, or available for purchase. I want to
Could
say on March 6th.
would you say a little more about the book specifically in case
Yes.
people haven't heard of what that is?
Yes, it's called Cynical Therapies.
Okay.
Um, gosh, why do I forget all the subtitle there? Cynical Therapies, the anti-therapeutic nature of social or critical social justice. what it
Okay.
is, something along
Oh,
those lines.
that's a good title.
Yes. And then so the people that contributed to the book are all psychologists, academics, some are practicing
Mhm,
in the field, and some are researchers.
mhm,
There's a couple of people that were professors, but I believe I was the only one who wrote about Antioch in particular. I wrote about teaching from
mm,
the perspective of somebody who went to the same school 15 years prior and then came back to teach. So
okay.
that was my section, but most of the other chapters, I mean, really phenomenal people are part of the organization. So, people that are still doing their own research, academic
Mhm,
minded, intellectual people. My co-host, Yahoo's very intellectual himself.
mhm,
So I think my role has been to try to take all of that and put it into a layperson
mhm,
view, and to
mhm.
kind of let's have a rooted understanding of this from somebody who's not immersed in the psychological world, because all those concepts and these topics can get very heady.
Mhm, yeah.
So I think that's what I try to bring to it, because that's the way I teach and it's the way I understand it. So
Mhm,
if I'm thinking that something that maybe isn't as clear to me is being said, I want to, ask
mhm.
to expand a little bit.
Clarify. Yeah,
Yeah, but
yeah,
it's also edited, which is good. So we can make a little bit of, we have snafus and we can say, hey, let's do that again.
yeah,
And so
yeah.
that works pretty well. But no, it's going to be great. We're going to be rolling it out over, the next several weeks as the podcast or as the book is also coming out. It's really to
I can't
promote the
wait to
book.
read this. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, I have the manuscript. It's
Mm,
absolutely phenomenal. I have to tell you, there are chapters in there. A couple of people in there address the kind of the white male getting totally, sort of hammered, for lack
yeah,
of a better
yeah,
clinical word,
yeah.
in this environment. They actually went there. And I was
Okay.
so impressed to see that, and
Yeah.
to see that people were able to broach that topic in the
Mhm,
book, that these people were willing to discuss this and to make comments about that, because that's extremely taboo right now, obviously.
mhm,
And they were
mhm,
willing to kind of stand up for everybody having a seat at the table here, not
mhm,
just this
mhm.
one, group that's oppressed by another. Anyhow, so
That's
I was
fantastic because
impressed.
it feels like that's almost an untouchable area right now.
Completely
And
untouchable.
and that
Yes,
there shouldn't be untouchable areas when we're talking
yes,
about human psychology. We should be able to
yes,
put it all on the table.
yes.
Mhm,
100%. And that's exactly what that is,
mhm,
which also helped me understand why it was hard to get a publisher, and that, CTA
mhm.
Val Thomas, who had CTA, had to self-publish.
Did she?
That
Okay.
it made, yeah, it
Mhm,
made sense to me. Initially, I wasn't sure why it
mhm,
was so difficult, but when I saw that those components were in there, I understood why these mainstream publishers would kick that back and say, thanks, but no thanks. We
mhm,
love the book. We love what you're doing.
mhm.
And, we don't
And
want to
yeah, and we
necessarily,
can't be
yeah,
associated with some of this.
yeah,
Wow,
yeah.
wow. It's a
So,
strange time to be, I mean, you would think that we wouldn't be here with this silencing of ideas. It's
yes,
so, 1984.
it's so 1980, very Orwellian, all of
Yeah.
that. And it's shocking. So it was a breath of fresh air to be able to talk to some of these people who actually talked about and wrote about that, and why suicidality in males was so high, how
Mhm,
the
mhm.
CT, or I'm sorry, how the critical social justice component might play a role in that. I mean, we had just some really brilliant conversations.
Wow,
So
that is interesting right there, that
yes,
the component that critical social justice might have in the elevation of suicide in white males.
mhm,
I
in
think
their
that,
40s.
and so you go into that on the podcast with
So
these.
we go into that on the
Oh,
podcast.
that's yeah.
Yes. So the authors who wrote about, well, they're, I mean, there's some co-authored chapters, and some people wrote their own. But yes, we went into that a little bit, and it's good. It was hard to not. It was hard to stay focused on the book and not just launch into, the issues at large and how we got here. but
Yeah, I
actually just keep
bet.
it focused,
Yeah.
which we'll do. I mean, there's just so much to do. There's so much to say that we'll be able to do that in the future. But it turned out that, I mean, we were recording, I think, expecting 15 to 20-minute episodes at the most. And we recorded for over an hour for each person. So then we had to
It's
go
so
back and
hard to
cut
keep
it.
it
Yeah.
short. Yeah. Are you cutting them down to that like 15 to 20 and making them bite sized?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're probably
I think,
losing a lot of good material.
yeah. So I think the first cut, I think, was of the first couple episodes was in the 30 to 35 minutes or to
Okay.
40-minute range.
Hmm.
And I think we kind of came to a conclusion that if it was engaging and rich enough, people were going to listen and they would stay engaged.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
let's not be rigid about
Hmm.
the time frame. I think the challenge is just to make sure that the material that's in there, uh, from author to author, gives different perspectives
Hmm.
on different parts of this movement or this infiltration, if you will. I think that's going to be the challenge, or that's going to be the challenge for us. And also, it's so easy to go into the weeds on all of these topics, especially because I can relate. As a former professor, I guess myself, I can relate a lot to some of the things that came up and what I watched, like these white males, how I watched them devolve into utter emotional turmoil and madness, total trauma and
Hmm.
total bullying and all of that. So there's a lot of it where I'm jumping in and saying, wow, I can totally see how that was happening. This is
Hmm.
what's going on, what was
Yeah.
going on for us. Anyway, so some of that's valuable, some of it needs to be cut, but
I think I really
it's
like
good,
that. I think that
good
the
material.
interchange, the dialogue is what is where things get really interesting, honestly.
Yes,
I don't think
yes,
I find a dialogue more interesting than a monologue,
yes,
you know?
100%. And I think that's what we try, and that's what we've tried to create. And I think trying to balance has been the big thing, and look, this is one of the reasons that people liked taking my classes is that I was always very down to earth. I will take a very complicated term and break it down into, tell it to me like I'm 8 years old, kind of a
Mhm,
thing.
mhm,
That I think makes it accessible, but that's how I learn best. And so
mhm,
for me, that's kind of the role I've taken, is just I'm with these people that in some way, I mean, they've accomplished so much and even so much more than I have. I mean,
mhm,
just so much
mhm,
more,
mhm,
that the approach I've had to take is to say, okay, well, let me help make this accessible. Let me do what
mhm,
I did as a teacher and what I did as an educator. What I
mhm,
love to do is to take that information and to make it accessible by just using common, lay people language. And
mhm,
so I think that's because if I hadn't have done that, I mean, I was quite amazed and just taken aback by the amount of just and academically minded people that we were interviewing, that I
mhm.
almost felt like, gosh, do I belong here? Like, should I
Oh,
even be in this kind of a role? Because these people have done so much more.
mm,
There's sort of imposter syndrome
yeah.
that I'm very familiar with. Anyhow, so I'm being very open here about
No,
that.
no,
But
yeah, I think that's something
it
everybody
was,
feels to some
yeah,
extent, especially in professions that are so, there's, such hierarchical, you know,
yes,
ranking,
yes,
basically. Yeah.
yes. And
Mhm,
there's so much competition. And
mhm,
I saw that a lot, even at Antioch, the competition with with the academics at that level
mhm,
was extremely, and I mean, it was just tenacious, and it
mhm,
was
mhm,
almost in a way, it sort of sets you up to feel, I don't know, I had to disconnect a little bit from that to be able to teach. And this is not just about Antioch and wokeism. This is about teaching and the world of psychology and the difference between getting your doctorate versus your master's. And that may
mhm.
not be very interesting to, the average person
Well,
here, but it plays a
if
role a
I
lot
think
in
that it
how
does
you're
play.
respected.
Absolutely, and I think that what you're contributing there is really valuable because for one thing, you are one of those people to a lot of people, you know? A lot of people are, well, this is a college professor, this is a person of great esteem, and I'm intimidated to be speaking to this person who
Yes.
has this expertise and this knowledge and these experiences. But then also you have this ability to break things down in a very grounded way.
Thank you.
And those reflections that you provide when you're speaking to one of these people who are even more sort of inaccessible
Yes.
and academic seeming,
Yes.
providing that reflection builds a bridge for all of the rest of us to sort of see and understand and kind of hear you process it, because your reflection is going to add something as well. It's going to add
Yes.
your synthesis of the information. And so I think that's a really great contribution.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mhm.
That's what I hoped. I mean, I had to find my role in this, and what is it that I need to, what is it that I have to bring to the table? And it's
Mhm.
not going to be all the extra research, and it's not going to be all of the extra, experience, but it's going to be that it's the synthesis of the information to
Mhm.
make it accessible and digestible. And interestingly enough, that was one of the first evals I got when I was teaching at Antioch was, thank you for making very difficult, complicated information digestible for us,
Mhm.
because I tried to bring a lot of real life, you know, uh, examples to
Mhm.
help people really understand what we were doing. So
Yeah. Well, that's so much more interesting than dry data.
I think so. I mean, I hope so.
I think it really is.
Yeah, I
And
appreciate
I
that.
also think we've had an over reliance, and I know I say this a lot, but I think we've built a culture of over reliance on experts. And this sort of sense that, oh, I'm just me. This thing you're talking about with imposter syndrome. Um, this Who am I to say? Who am I to think? Who am I to make this decision? I should let the experts decide. It's kind of like the science is settled, these kind of catchphrases that we hear, like, oh, somebody smarter than you already thought about this. And
Yes,
now you just have to go along and
yes,
line and and like the critical social justice model, it's this overly
yes,
simple, like, this is how race works, this is how gender works, just swallow it whole.
yes,
Don't question it. You're not smart enough to question it because we said so. It's this really like authoritarian mom because I said so kind of model.
yes,
And I I really want to see a move away from that. And going back to trusting our own intuition and our gut instinct, because I think our trust in experts has been really used against us in
yes,
recent years in a lot of ways. And I don't know, hearing somebody sort of do the work. I think there's a couple of people that I think of right off the top of my head. Jordan Peterson is one. He's
yes,
somebody, he's a brilliant man. He's very educated, he has all the academic qualifications. And the thing that makes him so fascinating to listen to is how he shows his work, how he like goes through the process of thinking in this really unguarded way, which shows
yes,
you the behind the scenes of somebody coming to conclusions about things.
yes,
And you realize that that's kind of the thought that we all take this stumbling thought
yes.
process. And then somebody else I think of is honestly Joe Rogan.
Oh, yes,
When I listen to him talk to guests, he shows this intellectual curiosity where he's not afraid to say, "Oh, I don't know that. Would you tell me
yes,
about it?" And I think
yes,
that there's all this posturing that people do when they're in
yes,
conversation. "Oh yeah, I know so and so," or "I know that I've read that book," or
yes,
whatever it is. And people like this name dropping kind of thing. And
yes,
you hear him just be honest
yes,
about where he's ignorant. And I love
yes,
that because it models that we all come from wherever we come, and we can have curiosity and be open to new information, but we still get
yes,
to synthesize it ourselves.
yes. It's my reaction to Joe Rogan is because so Yako, who's my co-host for this podcast, absolutely just really respects him quite a bit, and
Mhm.
I think has used Joe Rogan, maybe his style or just some
Okay.
components of how he is, and has really brought that into it, served as
Mm,
somewhat of a framework. I don't think it's exactly, and we're not doing exactly the same thing, but
mhm,
uh that's one of the people that I think he really respects and admires in terms of how he's put his podcast together. So that influence is certainly brought into our conversations
mhm,
as well. And I think that's why, and I think that's part of what he and I talked about too, is that it's okay to just say, I don't understand. That's very heady. Can you please make it make sense for me?
Yeah.
And that's the important, part that I think, and it's, I think, again, why I love teaching. I mean, it was a
Mhm.
challenge and I liked taking that on, and I liked being able to say, I don't know. And sometimes in class, I would say, all these words and jargon, here's what it boils down to. And, just here, one sentence that
Mhm.
just sort of encapsulates an entire
Mhm.
concept,
Mhm.
not to take away from the levels of complexity that we talk about in psych school and all that, but to be able to, again, make it make sense to me.
Mhm. Mhm.
One example would be the trauma lens. I used to talk about the fact that, your lens and through which you see the world, if we're teaching about trauma, those lenses, are created from your experience, how broken your lens is, but
Mhm.
are you wearing rose colored glasses, but
Mhm.
in obviously a more in-depth way. So, I would give examples that we've all seen a million times. How does trauma play out every single day in your life? Okay. You have a partner or you're in a relationship, and, you're married or with somebody, and, you spill milk on the floor or accidentally, and then somebody gets frustrated, the other person gets frustrated and asks you if you can, kind of wipe that up because they've got their hands full, and then automatically, your trauma lens
Mhm.
may
Mhm.
hear that, please clean that up, and interpret it as, oh my gosh, you're being critical of me
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
you are trying to put me down. And why do you always tell me I'm
Mhm.
making mistakes? And why do you always tell me this? And
Mhm.
that, in all of a sudden, there's my critical dad in my ear, that I'm
Mhm.
now never good enough. And a huge fight for,
Yeah.
explodes from something that was actually just misinterpreted,
Right.
because the trauma lens, the filter, our
Mhm.
glasses that we see the world, our lens, distorted what that person actually was trying to say, which is, please just clean that up. That's a
Yeah.
simple, non-threatening, ask of another person. Anyhow, so I used to use
Yeah, that's a
examples like that
wonderful
a lot.
metaphor. I think that's really great because it sort of gives you a visual um,
Yeah. Yes.
perspective. Yeah. Mhm.
Yes. Because
Mhm.
people would say, well, I didn't have some major big, sexual abuse history
Mhm.
and whatnot.
Yeah.
So how could my trauma be playing out in a relationship? And in couples work, you always want to know how people grew up, how those two partners, develop their own view on the world, where that came from, because it
Mhm.
impacts the way they relate to
Mhm.
each other, et cetera, and all those things that go with it, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I would try to do that with these concepts, and really break them down and
Mhm.
use those things as an example. And that was the kind of stuff that used to get people to understand, I think, and
Mhm.
create good conversation, because they started to say, wow, I can see how I do that. I can see how the way
Mhm.
that sounds is interpreted in one way for me and
Mhm.
might have meant something else from the person who was delivering the
Yeah.
message, right? So,
Yeah.
you have
That's
the
good.
person delivering it, and then you
Then the
internalizing
receiver.
it, and the
Yeah.
receiver making sense of it, et cetera. Anyhow, so
Yeah.
that's teeny little. So I try to stay with that and feel as though that's the contribution I can give, is to make it make sense.
Yeah.
Um, so
Uh,
anyhow, I don't
I
know,
want to
kind of
go
straight
over to
off,
the
but
chat real quick and see. So, William Joyner, thank you. That's really sweet of you. Mark Cavendish says, so sad. I think we're talking about earlier when we were talking about the rates of suicide increasing.
oh yes,
Um, uh, S. Coville 7, I think that's what how to read your username. Thank you. You say, I don't see the need to keep things short. And I kind of agree with that.
Mhm.
But then again, everybody has their the different way that they want to do things. So I tend to agree
Absolutely,
with that because I like longer
sure,
conversations, but I also do have kind of a sense when I'm talking with people that I want to try to keep it under an hour usually, because I feel like maybe that's a
yeah,
chunk people are expecting, but
yeah,
um, and then Jay Bourne says everything has become a prioritization of credentials with complete disregard to the substance behind them. And
there it
yeah,
is.
yeah, I think I agree. The credentialism,
Yes,
and it's been something that I've um, kind of grappled with myself as I'm trying to decide can I salvage a career out of
sure,
an almost master's degree. and how do I go forward? Do I need credentials? Do I need this and that? And I've kind of come to that same decision that the substance behind something is more important than the credentials. And anyway, that's a long
Yes,
discussion, but I can say that I can relate. And then Byzantine
100%.
Ladybug says, not all mental illness is trauma-based, and putting that burden on clients is unfair and is a form of gaslighting. And I think that's true. And I'll let Christine respond to that.
Mhm.
But I think that she's also, just to preface that, coming from a perspective of teaching about trauma.
Yes,
So that's where
correct.
that's coming from. But I'll let you go
Correct.
ahead and give a longer response.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's that's from just the perspective of teaching. It's because I used to teach intro to trauma. I used to teach traumatic grief and loss. So I taught a couple of courses that focused specifically on that.
Mhm.
And that was where they needed to they needed to understand how someone's worldview comes to be and how it becomes shattered in a sense. Okay, why we have these assumptions, essentially why we might have these assumptions, how trauma might contribute to that. So the focus of the course wasn't really, of those courses, it wasn't even on diagnosing. It was on understanding how trauma in childhood, early childhood, through all those developmental years, more so than even more so than even experiencing a traumatic event as an adult. I mean, we were talking about how you shape your worldview as a child, and through that lens, when you've experienced X amount of traumas, how that plays out in your daily life. So it was about trauma, and we needed to understand it in that context more so than it being about diagnosing or some mental health issues, or just labeling everybody as having trauma and that's it.
Right.
I used to joke around in class a lot and say, hey, to be a human is to experience trauma. And
Yeah.
that was a joke kind of thing I'd loosely say, but
Mhm.
I didn't have a lot of diagnosing in my classes for that reason,
Mhm.
actually.
Mhm.
Um, I just didn't do that. There are a couple times where we're sort of required as part of the course, the curriculum standards for the states,
Mhm.
essentially. But I avoided that as much as possible because I don't think it's so easy, and it's very complicated for people to really have. We love to sort of jump to a bottom line here because it helps us solve a problem, and you can't solve people. And I
Right.
think that's something that is really misunderstood when
Mhm.
people are starting to go to therapy and when
Mhm.
people are
Mhm.
starting to learn in class to be a therapist.
Mhm.
Is
Mhm.
there's not we are not problems to fix. I've never had that approach. Maybe some have, but that's
Mhm.
not been me. But
I
we're
think
there
that's a
to,
really interesting point to make. It's,
yeah,
yeah, simply put, but it's a really good point.
yeah. We're dynamic.
Mhm.
We have a lot of pieces to our puzzle, and we have a lot of
Mhm.
pieces to the quilt of
Yeah.
life, I guess. So anyhow,
Well, she comes back in, Byzantine Ladybug, and says, "Okay, my apologies, I'm coming in a bit late." No, no need to apologize at all. It's just,
no
and these
apologies
things,
at
I mean,
all. It's
yeah, this
important,
this live stream thing is kind of fun. It's just kind of loose,
yeah,
and
very,
I'm trying to remember to record them so that I can put them back up on the channel afterwards,
yes,
because
yes,
it's hard when you go to the channel, you don't see the lives under videos. You have to go
yes,
live. So they
yes,
stay up under live, but then I'll upload them as videos later. But the live format means that you might come in at any point in a conversation and not
definitely.
know what was said before. So
Yeah,
it makes total sense. And yeah,
absolutely.
I think that in pop psychology, trauma is a concept that's being overused quite a bit, and we're hearing it
Yes,
all the time. And it's sort of, um, you're right. I mean, that little note that you make about, oh, as human beings, we all experience trauma. I think that's an interesting thing to discuss, because yeah, we all experience things that are shocks to the system and painful, and to whatever extent. And then there's trauma in terms of like diagnostic post-traumatic stress disorder, and what is the
yes,
trauma that is
yes,
significant enough to merit certain
yes,
diagnoses. And so there's the whole concept is very muddy, I think.
yes.
And
It is.
I don't know if
I
you
mean,
want
if
to.
you go, yeah, it is muddy. And if you go by the diagnostic manual, the DSM, it doesn't, PTSD and all these,
Mhm.
the birth of that was from, veterans, right? That's where
Mhm.
PTSD sort of started.
Mhm.
And I don't know. This is I'm on the fence about this particular topic a lot, because in one way, I want to say that we dismiss a lot of things that have happened to us as that were traumatic. We dismiss them because we
Mhm.
just don't. We think sometimes of trauma as being, chronically sexually abused by somebody,
Mhm.
or being living in a war zone. I don't, whatever it is, where you're constantly, trying to save your life and all that.
Yeah.
Most people, have experienced some level of pain and sorrow or traumatic events. Um, I don't think it should be used as an excuse. I don't know if excuse is the right word. It shouldn't be used as the backdrop of the reason why your life is what it is. It
Like you mean
shouldn't,
an over identification with your trauma?
yes,
Okay.
an
Yeah.
over identification with the trauma. That's
Mhm. Mhm.
exactly what I think I want to say.
Mhm.
And I think that's where it gets muddy, because it's one thing to say and acknowledge, I've experienced these things, they were traumatic for me.
Mhm.
I've had, my mother got sick when I was very young. There's a lot of things in that
Yeah.
whole process
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
were very traumatic. And now I have my dad who has Alzheimer's, and
Mhm.
25 years later, and I'm all,
You're
feeling
it's
totally
digging
active.
up old things.
For
Yeah.
sure. And I
Yeah.
think that's just natural. I wouldn't
Yeah.
necessarily look at myself as being in this category of leading with, my trauma or trauma informing my decisions. It's just
Mhm.
pulling up, it's just a natural process where I'm naturally going to think about my mom when
Mhm.
I was 20 something years old and in graduate school and she was dying. So
Mhm.
so there's one thing to over identify with it. It's something else to totally dismiss it altogether.
Right.
There's certain
Yeah.
people that'll never watch that. There's certain people that'll never watch, a one kind of die and go through all those stages of death. And I'm not
Mhm.
talking even about my father. I'm talking about actually my mom. That was
Yeah.
isn't
Yeah.
very close with her. My
Yeah.
father is
You
a
were
whole different.
young, weren't you?
Yeah. So there's a whole different.
Yeah.
And then there are
Yeah.
people that are gonna never be able to relate to having, an authority figure or a parent or whatever who's
Mhm.
chronically abusing you, and that you
Mhm.
don't, why don't you just, okay, DV, let's just talk about that for a second. Why
Yeah.
you don't just leave the person. I don't understand why you can't just leave.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of experiences that people are going to have different ways in which it affects them. I think it's over identification with the trauma, and also under recognizing that what you've gone through may
Mhm.
have had some impact on how you are today.
Mhm.
It's a
Mhm.
balancing act, but I
Mhm.
never liked the idea of survivor. I liked the idea of somebody who was resilient or
Mhm.
resiliency,
Mhm. Mhm.
because you can't, just because you've gotten through one particular piece of trauma in your life, no one can promise you that's not going to happen again. We used to have kids that when I worked in grief, they'd come in and we'd have these children whose parents died in this horrible, awful way. And the urge was to tell the kid and promise them that'll never happen again.
Mm.
And then the kid's second parent would die. I had seen it more times than I can count.
Mm.
So those kids, we can't
Oh,
promise,
that's
you
so
can't do
hard.
that.
Yeah.
You
Yeah. No.
cannot promise,
You don't,
you cannot,
nothing is promised.
nothing's promised. Tomorrow's not
Yeah.
promised. And 2 hours from now aren't promised. I mean, it's a really, and I didn't care for that either. So again, I think there's all these kind of moving pieces that can dismiss the nuance. And that's, again, just everything we're talking about kind of comes back again to nuance,
Yes.
and dismissing again the uniqueness of something, how that
Yeah.
impacts
Yeah, it's so
you. And
true. You're talking about like this over here and this over here, but
yes,
we need to come back to the
yeah,
the shades of gray.
yes, that most of life is in the gray. And
Mhm.
again, I used to tell my students all the time, like, well, Christine, what would you do if X, Y, and Z happens? Sometimes I'd say, well, I don't know yet. I don't know. I can't answer that right now because I actually
Yeah.
don't know. Let's think about this for a minute. Let's talk about it for a minute. But as a therapist and in life in general, there's black and white, and very few things are black and white.
Mhm.
There's like three or four, right, in our profession
Mhm.
that are black and white. You cannot harm or abuse somebody. You have to report if somebody's going to harm themselves or
Mhm.
someone else, etc. That's it. There's
Mhm.
all this gray that ebbs and flows in the middle. And if you cannot live within the gray in this profession, you're not going to be able to move forward in this profession,
Mhm.
because the uncertainty, and you've probably experienced this too, Leslie, even though, you didn't continue as far in the time that you have. Just think about the people in your personal life, even, like,
Mhm.
let's forget about professionally. life is more uncertain than it is certain most of the time. I mean, this is why when these things
Mhm,
happen,
mhm,
the major trauma happens to somebody, it's so painful because we don't live under that constant knowingness that this horrible thing is
mhm,
going to happen to me. We
mhm,
just don't know what's going to
mhm,
happen.
mhm.
That's kind of it. I'm sort of talking in circles, but my point is
No,
uncertainty
yeah,
is anxiety provoking.
right, right.
And that's what the gray is the living in the uncertainty. And if you
Yeah.
can't do that, so you add the wokeness and all that to the profession, and it makes it that much
Yeah.
more difficult to do
And
all this.
those are these black and white things that are being brought in right
Yes.
alongside of all this
Yes.
gray, and it's very confusing. But I can see how it's very comforting in some ways to have more black and white. So for
Sure.
people who want more certainty and who are experiencing a lot of anxiety in an uncertain world, having those quick answers is interesting and helpful.
Yes.
More helpful than interesting, I guess. But
Yeah.
the what you said about trauma and how it influences the way that we develop as people. I kind of I there was this quote that I read a while back. I wish I remembered the quote. I wish I remembered who it was from, but I thought it was really beautiful. Maybe somebody will remember it and tell me. But it was about how when we go through a forest and we see the trees bend this way and that to reach the light, we don't think about them as being malformed and misshapen.
Mm,
And we see the forces of nature and the forces of growth, the pressures that growth put on them that bent them the way that they're bent so that they're not straight, but we don't
yes.
judge them and see them as wrong. And we're the
Yes.
same way. And we have all been shaped by the experiences that we've had, the positive and the negative. And I think that there's something really healing about acknowledging those things, but not living in them and dwelling in them either. So there's
Yes.
that line between being compassionate to oneself without over identification or
Yes.
dismissal and bypass of
Yes.
those things that we've experienced.
Yes. I love that. I
Mhm,
love that because I'm just picturing myself, and I've never heard that quote, but I'm picturing myself kind of walking through a forest and seeing that, and
mhm.
just realizing that that's the uniqueness of what nature
Yeah.
um, has, produced, and
Mhm,
we don't walk through with judgment on that tree being anything not good enough, a not good enough tree, or something that's not
mhm,
beautiful
yeah.
in some
We
way.
in fact, they're more beautiful sometimes because they're
Absolutely,
unique.
absolutely,
And there's a forest full of straight trees, but the one that's a little
sure,
curvy and interesting. I mean, there's something beautiful about it.
very.
Mhm,
And it's still growing, and that's the idea of the
mhm,
resilience component. It's still there, it's still growing and thriving.
mhm,
And it's something that you know, that word resilience, it's
mhm,
so much more powerful to me than the word survivor because
mhm,
I we've all been survivors really. I mean, we survive day to day and all this. Are we thriving? That's a different question. And how do you thrive? What is resilience? It's not just about being a survivor. It's about being able to create a life for yourself that has some sort of meaning and purpose,
mhm,
not over identify with your trauma, but be able to understand how that,
mhm.
past kind of connects to this bigger picture of who you are and
Yeah.
how you might be that beautiful bended tree or whatever that's in the forest. And I'm not into cliches all that
Mhm,
much, but I think that one is such a beautiful way to imagine it because we can all relate, I think, to walking through a forest and seeing a bend in a tree that looks different and saying, "Oh, look at that. I wonder what happened. It's so
mhm,
pretty." And pulling out your camera and taking some photos.
mhm,
There's something that's so powerful about that. That's a beautiful metaphor.
I
Um,
love what you say about survivor versus resilient, like those two
yes,
words and those two concepts, because survivor, it's like a backwards facing term. I mean, you're looking at what happened to you. It puts the
yes,
focus on what did you survive
yes,
versus resiliency, which has an implication of having gone through something, but its
yes,
focus is on the continued growth. And so it's a
yes,
forward facing term rather than a backwards face.
yes,
So I think that's really a great
yes.
contrast to pull out.
I mean, yeah, it's important because there's a sense of, if we say you don't want your trauma to define you for the rest of your life or whatever,
Mhm.
surviving, it's passive. It's like you said, it's more of a backwards facing rather than a forward facing. When you're resilient, you have an understanding that bad things are going to happen probably again at some
Mhm.
point.
Mhm.
Maybe not the same thing. We're not saying the same thing.
Mhm.
We're not saying maybe now as an adult, I have the power to make a different decision. I have the power to say no. I have the etc. All of that.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
I cannot promise you, nor can you promise anybody, anything that tomorrow, my husband won't go off to work and get into a car accident and die. No
Right.
one can do that. There's no such thing as, well, I've experienced enough pain for a lifetime, so I'm done. That means everything forward is going to
Mhm.
be fine. The
Mhm.
resilience piece is the to what extent are you able to grow and to move and to take some sort of forward pro action, create meaning in your life and go forward. And that does not mean to forget or to
Mm-mm.
dismiss, or that, you don't ever look at that again. That's what resilience is. It's not about promising somebody it's not going to happen again. It's about
Mhm.
saying, I have the tools to deal with that and I can move forward, and I will be hurt again, but I understand that I can probably get up and I
Yeah.
can create meaning and whatever in my life
Yeah.
again. Anybody who's
Exactly.
experienced grief will know that,
Yeah.
so that's why I didn't Survivor to me was just you're just getting by.
Yeah.
You're barely getting, maybe that's where you are for a while too. And that's okay
Yeah.
too. But
Yeah.
those are two different things for me. I always taught it differently because I felt that that was what resilience was.
Mhm. Mhm. I think that's really a beautiful explanation of the difference between those two mindsets. And I
Yeah.
agree. I mean, there is a place where it's appropriate to use survivor. It's not to say that there's
Yes.
not, because that
Yes.
that really is, there are things that happen to people that really take a
Yes.
chunk out of them, and maybe forever and maybe for a time. So it's not to dismiss that as a concept, because it has its place for sure. It's
Yes.
just that it is a different mindset. It's a totally
Yes.
different thing. Yeah.
And if you're maybe a survivor because you're in constant crisis for years and
Mhm.
years, then that's okay. I mean, there's nothing bad about that.
Mhm.
It's just making, right, kind of just distinguishing the two as being, maybe they're
Mhm.
interlinked in some way,
Mhm.
but they have their place,
Mhm.
and you're right that the idea of being a survivor is significant in its own right,
Mhm.
and in the way
Mhm.
that people understand it or experience it. But it took the water down, that's anyhow. Yes, we'll
Yeah.
just leave it there.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I'm glad we were able to kind of go into that whole concept of trauma a little bit and take a tangent.
Yes.
And that whole side road was off of discussing the podcast, which I'm really interested in hearing
Yes.
a little bit more about, and um, how, so you've done
Yeah.
you've done a series of interviews with the authors of the new book,
Yes.
that for anybody who's
Yes.
just joining us, we're talking about the book that is coming out called critical
cynical
cynical.
cynical cynical therapies, the anti-therapeutic. I'm gonna have to find,
You have to look it up again. It's
gosh.
about it's about social justice, and about how it's
Yes.
antithetical to
Yes.
therapy. So I love
Yes.
this. I cannot wait for this book.
It is. It's great. Okay, here it is. So cynical therapies, let me just read this. Perspectives on the anti-therapeutic nature of critical social justice.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So
So it's
that
on the
and so
website.
Christine and Yako are hosting a podcast, and so
Yes.
far, and this is not launched yet, right? It's not live yet.
Yes. It's
Okay.
not live yet.
Okay.
So
So
we're just going to roll out these episodes with the launch of the book. The launch of the book is March 6th. We hopefully we started a CTA YouTube channel, and that's
okay.
where these episodes are going to be once they're loaded. And so we
Okay.
haven't quite decided yet. We've been doing interviews every week for the past couple of weeks, but we don't we got to figure that all out. However, when it is launched on the channel, what's very exciting about that is that we can use the channel to do live streams, and we can use
Mhm.
the channel to post some of your stuff to
Mhm.
Leslie.
Mhm.
We can
Mm.
cross promote in a
Yeah,
way
that's
some of
awesome.
the things you're doing.
Mhm.
So
Well, I
that's
can't wait for this, because I
great.
think that it's so needed, and I'm so glad that this is going forward. I think you and Yako are going to do a
Thank
fantastic
you.
job. And
Yes.
so are you have do you have like a release sort of pace that you have planned? Are you going to do like one a week or a couple a week
I
or?
think we're still trying to figure that out. I think it's proven to be a little bit more challenging, the editing process,
Okay.
because it's we're trying to just figure out how to, I guess, what pieces we think absolutely need to be there, what we want to let go of. That process has been, I mean, we're just kind of learning as we go.
You know,
Even so far as the lighting,
I will say
it's
that is
all of it.
all of that. You can really go. That's one of the reasons. I mean, I'll just say
Yeah.
I don't do any of that stuff at all.
Yes.
I have just been
Yes.
like, you can tell my lighting is pretty
Yes.
crappy. I'm not. I'm trying to be better, but it's not fabulous. And um, I don't know if I would have the stamina for a real podcast. I actually have one episode or one interview or conversation or whatever you want to call it that I need to put out. That I did. It's a fantastic conversation with a really interesting person. And I did it 2, 3 weeks ago, but I have to edit it. And that's the problem. I
Yes.
haven't edited a
Yes.
single thing I've put on this channel. If I've not liked it, I've just done another take. You
Right.
know, so it's all like warts and all, it's in there. And so this is all
Yes.
very raw. And I mean, I probably would pick up more followers or whatever if I wanted to make things slick, but I just haven't had the interest in being slick. So I can see if you're trying to package something nicely, there's a lot of work that
Yes.
goes into that. So
Yes.
I can imagine you guys are in it.
Yes. Yes. I mean, well, what you've done though too is incredible. And we do want to get to a point, I think, where we have the option to do just very raw live stream shows.
Hmm.
So that was kind of the development of, hey, let's actually have a YouTube channel so we can
Hmm.
upload. But
Yeah.
yeah, the work is in the editing. Yaku's doing kind of mostly all, I mean, he's doing all of the editing, I should say. And,
Mhm.
I don't have that background and he really does. And so it definitely is going to take a minute. But I think, I mean, once we get into hopefully we'll be able to interview all the authors. We're probably about halfway through all of them. And there's a few left that, we want to try to get everybody. That's the goal,
Mhm.
is to get
Mhm.
everyone if we can.
Awesome. Yeah.
So, we'll see how we roll it out or whatever, and what comes of that. But it is exciting. There's a lot of opportunities, I think, for Critical Therapy Antidote, that for the organization itself to start to grow, and partnerships.
Mhm.
And there's a lot
Mhm.
of things coming down the pipeline, I think, that are going to be really meaningful,
Yeah, well, I hope so. I think
encouraging.
it's such a valuable
Yeah.
group, and I love that there are people out there concerned about this stuff and taking steps
Yes.
to call it out.
Yes.
So,
They are, and it's definitely surprising to see how many. I didn't realize there would be so much, and that's actually very reassuring, I think.
well, when you get the podcast launched, and I hope you come back sooner too. We can talk again, but maybe we can do
As
another
always. Always, always.
conversation. And
Yes.
I love
Yes.
I love what you're doing, and I cannot
Love
wait
what you're doing as
to see it.
well. This has
Yeah.
been such a gift. I mean, honestly, to me, really such a gift. As I mentioned before, I've really been very, very lost ever since all of this
The stuff
happened
with
with me.
Antioch, with you, with your
Yes.
job and your career. Yeah,
Yes.
I know, it's
Just
such a
wandering around. Yes.
yeah.
Totally lost. And,
Mhm.
I just admire and respect what you're doing so much. And it's such a gift to me that I was able to connect with CTA, and also with you personally as a student. I mean, just somebody who really understands what was happening there, and
Mhm.
continues
Mhm.
to happen and stuff. So I really just am so grateful. So thank you very much for inviting me on your shows, and you're doing amazing work. People absolutely love it. The word is getting out, and things are happening,
Yeah,
and
I
that's
thank
amazing.
you. I mean,
Yes.
I just feel like if more of us start to just have
Yep.
conversations, frankly, like
Yes.
from
Yes.
a place of concern and compassion and curiosity about what we can do to fix
Yes.
things and to make things better, but not from a reactionary perspective,
Yes.
I think that we just it's good to continue that work in whatever
Yes.
way that we can, because
Yes.
there's just too much polarization. There's too much splitting, too much black and white thinking going on. And,
Absolutely.
to whatever extent I can be involved in that, while I have the energy for it, I want to do it,
Yes, right.
but it is draining
Same. Yes, it is.
to always
It's
be in
draining.
that mode. But
Yep.
anyway, yeah, I've been really grateful to meet you as well. I am so inspired by what you've done and taking a stand like you have. And I don't know if you were able to see, is just yesterday, but I had a great conversation with Erin Kinsfater.
I didn't get a chance. I
Yeah,
saw
it
that it
was
was,
just
yes,
last night, so
yes,
you probably haven't had a chance yet.
yes.
But I'm going to post that video up. It's just on my lives right now, but it's going to go on. And
Great.
he's another professor
Oh,
who
great.
has a similar, well, different and similar in some ways. So his experiences, I think
Sure.
that, I don't know if you've ever had a chance to connect with him, but I
I
think,
haven't, but I'd love to.
yeah, people like yourself and like Aaron,
Hmm.
and I've spoken with, there was another Antioch professor who contacted me, but he wanted to
Wow.
remain off the record because he has a
Wow.
non-disclosure agreement. So I can't talk about anything. I won't, out of, respect for that, I won't disclose anything that we talked about, but
Yeah.
it was another similar story. And so people who have, you've given up quite a bit in order to have the freedom to talk about what you're talking about. There
I
was a
didn't
lot of,
actually even know there was I didn't sign an NDA. I
yeah,
did not
yeah.
have that, did
It was
not
a
sign it,
different
did not,
circumstance a little bit,
different
but
kind of
yeah,
thing.
but
Okay,
similar,
right.
similar stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Wow. Well,
So
I feel very lucky then that seriously that I have been able to just be so open because I've never, signed anything
good.
about
Yeah.
that. So that's
Yeah.
a blessing, a
Yeah.
blessing in disguise. I'm happy to connect though with whomever, and it doesn't have to be a public thing, but even
Yeah.
to connect offline,
Yeah.
I think some strength in numbers and support. It's just very lonely to do this.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I'm so glad that there are ways for us to talk and
Same.
connect and that there are
Same.
groups forming around this.
Great.
So
Yes.
yeah. Yeah.
Great. I love
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Always a pleasure, and
Yeah,
we'll
you
be
too.
together soon. Yes.
Definitely. All right.
Okay. Take care.
You too. And